Four friends, Mark, Sarah, Jamie, and Lisa, decided to go camping in the remote Whispering Woods. The forest was known for its serene beauty and dense, towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. It was also known for its eerie legends, stories whispered by the locals about people who ventured in and never came back. But the friends dismissed the tales as mere folklore, excited for their adventure away from the city. They arrived at the campsite just before dusk, pitching their tents and gathering wood for a fire. As night fell, they sat around the crackling flames, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. Laughter echoed through the trees, drowning out the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures. As the night grew darker, the forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. "Did you hear that?" Sarah suddenly asked, her eyes wide. The group fell silent, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, faintly, they heard it. A whispering, barely audible, like a hushed conversation just out of reach. "It's probably the wind," Mark said, trying to sound confident. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It seemed to be coming from all directions, circling the campsite. Jamie shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "This isn't funny," Lisa said, her voice trembling. Mark stood up, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but more trees and underbrush. The whispering ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Let's go to bed," Mark suggested. "We're just spooking ourselves." Reluctantly, they agreed, retreating to their tents. But sleep did not come easily. The forest seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the air thick with unease. Lisa lay wide awake, staring at the canvas ceiling of her tent, every rustle and creak amplifying her fear. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard a soft voice outside her tent, calling her name. "Lisa, Lisa." Her heart pounded. She knew it wasn't one of her friends. They would never pull such a cruel prank. Mustering her courage, she unzipped the tent and peered outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a weak, flickering light. She saw nothing but shadows. "Lisa," the voice came again, closer this time. Panicking, she crawled out of the tent and ran to Mark's, shaking him awake. "Mark, wake up. Someone's out there." Mark groggily opened his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's calling my name." Mark grabbed his flashlight and emerged from the tent, scanning the area. The whispering had returned, more insistent and malevolent. It seemed to surround them, pressing in from the darkness. Suddenly, Jamie screamed. Mark and Lisa rushed to his tent, finding him thrashing in his sleeping bag, his face contorted in terror. "Wake up, Jamie," Mark shouted, shaking him. Jamie's eyes flew open, wild with fear. "The trees, they have faces." "They were watching me." Before anyone could respond, Sarah's voice called out from deeper in the woods. "Help. Help me." Without thinking, Mark sprinted towards the sound, his flashlight bouncing wildly. Lisa and Jamie followed, their breaths ragged with panic. They found Sarah standing in a small clearing, staring up at a tree. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Lisa cried, grabbing her arm. Sarah turned to them, her face pale. "Do you see them? The faces in the trees?" Mark shone his flashlight on the tree Sarah was fixated on. At first, it seemed like any other tree. But as he looked closer, he saw it. Vague, twisted faces carved into the bark, their eyes hollow and mouths open in eternal whispers. "We need to get out of here," Mark said urgently. "Now." As they turned to leave, the whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices. The faces on the trees seemed to shift and move, their hollow eyes following the group. They ran blindly through the forest, the trees closing in around them, branches clawing at their clothes and skin. They burst into a small, overgrown clearing, gasping for breath. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. "We can hide in there," Mark said, though his voice wavered. The group hesitated, but with the whispering voices threatening to return, they had no choice. They hurried inside, barricading the door with an old, rotting table. The cabin was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and the smell of decay. "What now?" Jamie asked, his voice shaking. "We wait until morning," Mark replied. "We just have to make it until morning." Hours passed in tense silence, the darkness outside pressing against the broken windows. Every now and then they heard a faint whisper, a reminder that they were not alone. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them, and one by one, they fell into a fitful sleep. Lisa awoke to the sound of footsteps. She looked around, her friends still asleep. The footsteps grew louder, coming from outside the cabin. She crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. A figure stood just beyond the trees, watching the cabin. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Panicking, Lisa backed away from the window, tripping over a loose floorboard. The noise woke the others, and they scrambled to their feet. "What is it?" Mark asked, alarmed. "Someone's out there," Lisa whispered. The whispering started again, louder and more insistent. The figure outside stepped closer, its features becoming clearer. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet it seemed to see them. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. They moved towards the back door, but as they reached it, the front door burst open with a loud crash. The figure stood in the doorway, its mouth open in a silent scream. The whispering turned into a deafening roar, echoing inside their heads. "Run," Mark shouted. They fled through the back door, into the night. The forest seemed alive, branches reaching out to grab them, the faces in the trees watching with malevolent glee. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The whispering had stopped. The faces in the trees were gone, and the forest seemed ordinary again. But they knew they could never forget the terror of the whispering woods. Exhausted and shaken, they made their way back to the campsite, packed up their things, and left as quickly as they could. As they drove away, the forest stood silent and still, a dark memory etched in their minds forever. And as the last car disappeared down the road, the whispering began anew, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to venture into its depths.